The frozen air cut like broken glass. 38 degrees below zero, and Second Lieutenant Nathaniel Ashford's hands wouldn't stop shaking. Not from the cold, from the weight of 200 men staring at him waiting for an answer that would either save their lives or end them. The intelligence map trembled between his fingers. Pencil marks traced a route through the mountains, a path no American had ever taken, a path that might lead 15,000 Marines to safety, or straight into a Chinese ambush that would turn the snow red for miles. Ashford was 22 years old. He'd been in Korea for exactly 43 days, and in the next 60 seconds, he had to make a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. But that moment, that impossible decision, was still 48 hours away. This story begins 2 days earlier when Nathaniel Ashford still believed he understood what war meant. Before we go further, leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, and if you haven't already, click subscribe. Stories like this one, stories about the decisions that define us and the prices we pay for them. These are the stories we tell here. Now let's go back to where it started, back to when Nate Ashford thought he had something to prove. Cambridge, Massachusetts, September 1949. The acceptance letter from Harvard Law School sat unopened on Nathaniel Ashford's desk. His father, Senator Harold Ashford, had pulled strings to get him that letter, the same strings he'd pulled for Nate's admission to Harvard College 4 years earlier. Nate stared at the envelope like it was a snake. 21 years old, top of his class in European history, fluent in 3 languages, and he'd never earned a damn thing on his own merit. Everyone knew it. The professors who gave him A's knew his father chaired the Armed Services Committee. The classmates who invited him to parties knew his family had a summer house on the Cape. Even Eleanor Brennan knew it. Eleanor, who sat across from him now in the Harvard Yard Coffee House, her engagement ring catching the autumn sunlight. They'd been promised to each other since childhood, their family's idea of dynasty building. She was beautiful, brilliant, kind, everything a man could want. And she'd never once asked Nate what he wanted. "Father says you should start at the firm in January," Eleanor said, stirring her coffee. "Work there while you're in law school. Build connections." Nate watched the steam rise from his cup. "What if I don't go to law school?" Eleanor's spoon stopped moving. "Don't be silly, Nate. It's already arranged." "I know it is. Everything's always arranged." She reached across the table, touched his hand. "What's this about?" Nate pulled the folded newspaper from his jacket pocket. The headline screamed, "Senator Ashford denies communist sympathies." Below it, a photo of his father leaving the House Un-American Activities Committee, hearing face-pale suit rumpled. "They're saying father passed intelligence to the Soviets during the war," Nate said quietly, "that he advocated for Stalin at Yalta. That's Joseph McCarthy being Joseph McCarthy. Your father is a patriot. Is he, or has everything I've ever believed about him been arranged too?" Eleanor withdrew her hand. "You're talking nonsense." Maybe he was, or maybe for the first time in his life, Nate was talking sense. He'd made his decision 3 days later. Walked past the Marine Corps recruiting office twice before he had the courage to go inside. The recruiter, a gunnery sergeant with a chest full of ribbons from the Pacific, had looked at his Harvard diploma and laughed. "Officer candidate, school son, you'll make lieutenant in 4 months." Nate had shaken his head. "I want to enlist. Regular infantry." "The hell you do, Harvard man like you." "I need to earn something," Nate had said. "Something nobody gave me." The gunny had studied him for a long moment, then slid the papers across the desk. "Your funeral, college boy." Eleanor had taken the news worse than his father. "You're running away," she'd said, tears streaming down her face. "Running from us, from your future, from everything." "I'm running towards something," Nate had replied. "I just don't know what yet." They'd fought. She'd cried. In the end, she'd kept the ring, but told him she'd wait 6 months. If he came home, they'd marry. If he didn't, she hadn't finished that sentence. His father hadn't spoken to him at all, just had his secretary send a letter stating that Nate's decision was ill-considered and emotionally immature. The trust fund would be frozen until he came to his senses. Nate had shipped out to Parris Island in October. By November, Joseph McCarthy's committee had charged Senator Harold Ashford with treason. By December, Nate was in Korea. And by the time this story truly begins on the frozen morning of November 27, 1950, Nathaniel Ashford had learned 3 important truths. First, that Harvard diplomas meant nothing when the temperature dropped below zero and men were trying to kill you. Second, that fear was a constant companion, something you learned to carry like extra ammunition. And third, that the worst decisions weren't the ones that got you killed. They were the ones that got other men killed instead. The Chosin Reservoir, North Korea, November 27, 1950, 0430 hours. Nate woke to the sound of bugles, Chinese bugles. He'd been in Korea for 6 weeks, long enough to know that bugles at 4:30 in the morning meant one thing: attack. He rolled out of his sleeping bag, fingers numb, reaching for his M1 Garand. Around him, the command post tent erupted into chaos. Men shouting equipment, clattering, the pop, 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 pop of small arms fire already starting in the distance. Captain Marcus Thornfield's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Everyone up, Chinese in the wire. We've got contact on 3 sides." Nate pulled on his boots. His parka grabbed his rifle and the leather satchel that contained the intelligence maps. His hands were shaking again. They'd been shaking every morning since his first firefight 3 weeks ago. Nobody had told him about that at OCS, that your body would betray you every single time. That courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to move despite hands that trembled and a heart that hammered against your ribs like it wanted to escape. Outside, the night was lit by tracer fire. Red streaks from the Chinese positions, green from the American lines. The temperature had dropped to -30, maybe lower. Nate's breath froze in the air, ice crystals forming on his eyelashes. The intelligence tent was 50 yards away. He ran. Mortars started falling before he was halfway there. The ground erupted in geysers of frozen earth and snow. Something hot whistled past his ear. A man screamed, the sound cutting off abruptly. Nate didn't look, couldn't look, just kept running. He dove through the tent flap, landed hard on the frozen ground. Captain Vincent Aldrich, the battalion surgeon, was already there, bent over a radio, shouting coordinates into the handset. "Say again, Able Company. Say again your position. Static, then overrun. They're in the perimeter. We need..." The transmission died. Aldrich looked at Nate, his face gray in the lamplight. "How many Chinese?" "I don't know, sir. Thousands. Maybe..." The tent flap burst open. Captain Thornfield stumbled in his right sleeve, dark with blood. At 35, Thornfield was, career Army, had fought across Europe with Patton. He had 3 daughters back in Georgia, Maggie, Sarah, and Beth, and a reputation for never losing his cool. He looked terrified. "We're cut off," Thornfield said. "Chinese hit us from 3 sides simultaneously. Able Company is gone. Baker Company is falling back. Charlie Company is holding, but barely. We've got maybe 200 effectives left from an 800-man battalion." Aldrich pressed a field dressing to Thornfield's arm. "What are your orders, sir?" "That's not up to me anymore." Thornfield pulled a yellow telegram from his pocket, handed it to Nate. "This came through 10 minutes ago. It's for you." Nate's hands shook as he unfolded the paper. "L. Ashford, stop. Intelligence maps your possession are only verifiable. Route inland from Chosen. Stop 15,000 Marines. 1st Division encircled Hagaru Rao. Stop coastal evacuation route destroyed. Stop, you are ordered to provide route guidance to remaining battalion elements. Stop, link with Marine Division. Stop, this is not a request. Stop, MacArthur said stop." Nate read it twice. The words didn't change. "They want me to lead the battalion out," he said slowly, "using intelligence maps." "That's what it says." Thornfield's voice was flat, emotionless. "Sir, I'm a 2nd lieutenant. I've been in country 6 weeks. There are captains, majors, dead or captured. I'm the ranking officer and I've got a bullet in my arm. Aldrich is a surgeon, not a line officer. That leaves you and your maps." Nate looked at the leather satchel he'd been carrying since Incheon. Inside were topographical maps, intelligence reports, reconnaissance photos. Information he'd compiled from half a dozen sources, some reliable, some not. Information that might be completely wrong. "Sir, these maps," Nate's voice caught. "The sources, some of them are questionable. There's a route marked here through the mountains, but I can't verify or can't guarantee." "Both, sir." Thornfield and Aldrich exchanged a look. Some silent communication passed between them, the kind that only men who'd fought together could share. "Son," Thornfield said quietly, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. No military courtesy, no bullshit. Just the truth." Nate nodded. "Do you believe these maps show a way out?" The tent was silent except for the distant sound of gunfire. Nate thought about Harvard, about his father, about Eleanor waiting in Boston, about all the things he'd run away from and all the things he'd been searching for. He thought about 200 men whose lives depended on his answer. "I'm 50% certain, sir," Nate said. "It's the best I can give you." 50%. Thornfield laughed, a sound without humor. "You know what our chances are if we stay here?" "No, sir." "Zero. The Chinese have us surrounded. We're out of ammunition, low on food, no air support, no reinforcements. By tomorrow night, everyone in this tent will be dead or in a prisoner of war camp." Thornfield met Nate's eyes. 50% is the best odds we're going to get. But sir, if I'm wrong. If you're wrong, we die a little faster. If you're right, Thornfield's voice trailed off. 15,000 Marines are trapped at Hagaruri. If we can link up with them, show them the route, we might save them all. The weight of those words settled on Nate's shoulders like a physical thing. 15,000 lives. Writing on maps he was only 50% sure about. From a source that might be a Chinese intelligence plant. There's something else you need to know, Aldrich said quietly. Your intelligence source, the one who provided these maps. Lee Chenwo, South Korean civilian, worked as a guide for the 8th Army. Did you know he's disappeared? Nate's stomach dropped. What he gone vanished 3 days ago, right before the Chinese offensive. Aldrich's voice was gentle, but the implication was clear. Some people think he was a Chinese agent all along, that everything he gave us was designed to lead us into an ambush. The tent seemed to spin. Nate gripped the edge of the map table. You're saying my maps might be deliberately false. I'm saying we don't know. Nobody knows. But MacArthur's headquarters reviewed everything Lee provided, and they think the mountain route is legitimate. Chinese don't know we have it, which means it's either our way out, Aldrich paused, or it's exactly where they want us to go. Thornfield pulled on his parka, wincing as the movement jarred his wounded arm. We move out in 30 minutes. Assemble everyone who can walk. We're leaving the wounded who can't be carried. Sir, we can't just... We can and we will. This is triage, Lieutenant. Save who we can save. Thornfield's voice hardened. You've got 50-50 odds on those maps. I've got 0% odds staying here. Sometimes in war you don't get good choices. Just less terrible ones. He pushed through the tent flap, leaving Nate alone with Aldrich and the maps. He's right, you know, Aldrich said after a moment. About the odds. That doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. Aldrich began packing medical supplies into a rucksack. Can I ask you something, Lieutenant? Sir, why'd you volunteer for Korea? Harvard man like you could have gotten a desk job stateside. Your father's a senator, was a senator. You had options. Nate looked at the maps spread across the table. Contour lines marking mountains he'd never seen. Rivers he'd never crossed. A route that might save 15,000 men or kill them all. I wanted to earn something, he said quietly. Something nobody gave me because of my last name. Well, Aldrich shouldered his pack. Congratulations, Lieutenant. You just earned the chance to save or doom 200 men. How's that feel? It felt like drowning. 30 minutes later, Nate stood in the frozen darkness and counted the survivors. 183 men. That's what remained of an 800-man battalion. Most were infantry from Charlie Company. Some were cooks, clerks, drivers, anyone who could hold a rifle. They stood in loose formation, breath steaming in the Arctic air, weapons held in numb fingers. They looked at Nate like he was supposed to have answers. He was 22 years old and he had no idea what he was doing. Thornfield stood beside him, right arm in a sling, now left hand gripping an M1 carbine. They're ready, Lieutenant. Your show now. Nate wanted to run, wanted to throw down the maps and tell them to find someone else, anyone else, someone who actually knew what they were doing. Instead, he pulled out the topographical map and spread it on the hood of a shot-up Jeep. A flashlight beam illuminated the pencil marks. Listen up, Nate said, his voice shaking. He cleared his throat, tried again. We're 42 miles from the marine perimeter at Hagaruri. The coastal route is gone. Chinese control everything between here and the sea, so we're going inland, through the mountains. Murmurs rippled through the formation. Someone said, that's suicide. Maybe, Nate admitted, but staying here is definitely suicide. The Chinese have us surrounded. By dawn, they'll overrun this position completely. He traced the route with a gloved finger. This path follows the Sudong River Valley, then cuts east through Funchailan Pass. The terrain is brutal. Mountains, sub-zero temperatures, probably Chinese patrols. But intelligence suggests this route is unguarded. They don't think we're crazy enough to try it. Intelligence from where? A sergeant called out. Staff sergeant, someone Nate couldn't remember the name. Too many new faces, too many dead ones. South Korean source, Nate said. Worked with the 8th Army for 6 months. Provided reliable information on Chinese positions, troop movements. Worked. The sergeant's voice was sharp. Past tense. He's disappeared 3 days ago. The murmurs got louder. Nate heard the words clearly. Bastards sold us out. This is a trap. We're following a damn spy's map. That's enough. Thornfield's voice cracked like a whip. You've got 2 choices. Follow Lieutenant Ashford and maybe live. Stay here and definitely die. Anyone who wants to stay, step forward now. Nobody moved. Good. We move out in 5 minutes. Light load, ammo rations, medical supplies only. Everything else gets left behind. Thornfield looked at Nate. Lieutenant, take point with Sergeant Sullivan. I'll bring up the rear. Nate nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Sergeant Garrett Sullivan materialized out of the darkness. 28 years old, from Georgia, he'd pulled Nate out of a Chinese ambush 3 weeks ago. Saved his life while taking shrapnel in his back. The chunks of metal were still in there, too close to his spine to remove safely. Ready, sir. Sullivan's voice was calm, steady. No, Nate admitted, but we're going anyway. Sullivan smiled, a flash of white teeth in the darkness. That's the Army way, sir. Do the impossible or die trying. They moved out at 0530 hours just as false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. 183 men walking single file into the frozen mountains, following a map that might be a lie, led by a 22-year-old who'd never led anyone anywhere. Nate walked at the front, Sullivan beside him, the leather map satchel bouncing against his hip. Each step took them farther from the defensive perimeter, farther from any hope of rescue, deeper into the unknown. The first hour was quiet. Just the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the rasp of hard breathing in the bitter cold. The men were exhausted, running on empty, pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. But they kept moving. At 700 hours, they reached the Sudong River. It was frozen solid, a ribbon of ice cutting through the valley. According to Nate's map, they needed to follow it north for 8 miles, then turn east into the mountains. According to his map, if the map was right, if Li Chenwo hadn't been a Chinese agent. If. Nate checked his compass, confirmed the heading, and kept walking. By 0900 hours, the sun was up, though it provided no warmth. The temperature remained locked at 30 below. Men's eyelashes froze together. Weapons iced up. The wounded who'd been able to walk at 0530 started falling behind. Aldrich did what he could. Treated frostbite, administered morphine to the worst cases, made impossible decisions about who could continue and who couldn't. By 1100 hours, they'd covered 6 miles. Still following the river. Still on the route the map showed. Still alive. That was something. Nate called a 10-minute halt. The men collapsed where they stood, too tired to even complain. Nate pulled out the map again, checked their position against the landmarks. So far, everything matched. The river bend where the map said it should be. The ridgeline to the east exactly as marked. The frozen waterfall, a cascade of ice 30 feet high. Maybe the map was real. Maybe Lee had been legitimate. Maybe contact left. Someone shouted. Nate's head snapped up. On the ridge above them, perhaps 200 yards away, he saw movement. Figures in white winter camouflage. Chinese soldiers. A lot of them. Everybody down, Thornfield yelled. Return fire. The world exploded into violence. Rifle fire cracked through the frozen air. Bullets whined off the ice. Men screamed. Nate dropped behind a boulder, fumbling with his M1. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the bolt. 8 rounds in the end block clip. He raised the rifle, tried to find a target. A Chinese soldier appeared on the ridge, aiming down at them. Nate pulled the trigger. The rifle bucked. The soldier dropped. Nate's first kill. He barely had time to process it before Sullivan was pulling him down while bullets stitching the air where his head had been. Stay low, sir. They've got the high ground. The firefight lasted maybe 3 minutes. It felt like 3 hours. When it ended, 7 American soldiers lay dead or dying. The Chinese had withdrawn, melted back into the mountains. But they'd be back. Now they knew where the Americans were going. Thornfield pulled Nate aside, his face grim. Your map just got us spotted. They're tracking us now. Sir, doesn't matter. We're committed. Can't go back, can only go forward. Thornfield grimaced, pressed his hand to his wounded arm. Blood was seeping through the bandage. How far to the turn east? Nate checked the map. 2 miles. Then we leave the river, start climbing into the pass. 2 miles, right. Thornfield raised his voice. Anyone who can walk on your feet, we've got 2 miles to cover before nightfall. The column formed up again. 176 men now. 7 dead left behind in the snow. Nate wanted to stop, wanted to go back, check if any of the 7 were still alive. Sullivan read his expression. Don't, sir, they're gone. We keep moving or we join them. They kept moving. By 1500 hours, they'd reached the eastern turn. The map showed a narrow trail climbing into Funchailan Pass. The terrain got worse from here, steeper, more exposed, colder. And according to the map, this was where the route became uncertain. Lee's intelligence had marked this section with a question mark and a note in broken English. Path, maybe here, not sure, use judgment. Use judgment. Nate stared at those words and felt something crack inside him. People were dead because of his judgment. More would die before this was over. All because a Harvard graduate thought he could read a map and play soldier. Sir Sullivan was looking at him concerned. You okay? No, Nate said honestly. But we're going anyway. They started climbing. The trail was barely visible, covered in snow and ice. Men slipped, hauled each other up. The altitude made breathing difficult. The cold was merciless. At 1700 hours, with darkness coming fast, they'd climbed 1500 feet. Nate called another halt. The men were finished running on nothing but fear and stubborn pride. Thornfield pulled Nate aside again. We need to stop for the night. Set a perimeter. The men can't go much farther. Sir, if we stop, we freeze. Temperature's going to drop to 40 below tonight. And if we keep going in the dark, we fall off a cliff and die that way. Pick your poison, Lieutenant. Nate studied the map, then the exhausted soldiers, made another impossible choice. We stop. 4-hour watches. Small fires no more than 3 men per fire. Anyone who falls asleep freezes to death. They made camp on a narrow shelf, backs against the mountain, 1,000-foot drop in front of them. Nate sat with Sullivan and a private named Whitmore, 18 years old, from Ohio. Whitmore kept pulling a letter from his pocket, reading it by firelight, then folding it carefully and putting it back. Letter from home, Nate asked. My mom. Whitmore's voice cracked. I was supposed to write back 3 weeks ago. Keep meaning to, but I don't know what to say. Can't tell her what it's really like, can I? No, Nate agreed. You can't. What could you say? How could you explain the cold that turned your fingers black, the fear that never left? The way death became normal, expected just another part of the day. You couldn't, so you wrote about the food, the weather, anything but the truth. Whitmore stared at the letter. If we don't make it out, will someone send this to her so she knows I was thinking about her at the end? We're going to make it out, Nate said with more confidence than he felt. You sure about that, sir? No, but we're going to try like hell. Sullivan threw another piece of wood on the fire. LT's right. We've come this far, haven't we? 6 miles through Chinese territory, and we're still breathing. That's something. 6 miles out of 42, Whitmore said quietly. 36 to go. How many of us you think will still be breathing at the end? Nobody answered that question. The night was the longest of Nate's life. The cold was savage, relentless. Men huddled around fires that provided barely enough warmth to survive. Some didn't wake up when their watch ended, frozen in their sleep. 3 more dead. At 600 hours, they moved out again. 173 men now. They'd lost 10 in 18 hours. At this rate, they'd all be dead long before they reached the Marines. The second day was worse than the first. The trail became steeper, harder to follow. Twice, Nate had to choose between paths, neither one clearly marked on his map. Both times he guessed. Both times he got lucky. At 1,400 hours on day 2, they were 12 miles in. Thornfield's arm was infected, the wound turning green despite Aldrich's best efforts. The captain was running a fever, stumbling, barely staying upright. Aldrich pulled Nate aside. He needs real medical treatment. Hospital, surgery. He's not going to last another day out here. We don't have a hospital. I know that, Lieutenant. I'm telling you what he needs, not what we have. Nate looked at Thornfield, saw the man who'd stood between him and a firing squad of his own men, saw a father with 3 daughters back in Georgia, Maggie, Sarah, and Beth. A soldier who'd fought across Europe and survived only to die in these frozen mountains because he'd trusted a 22-year-old with a questionable map. Keep him alive, Nate said. That's an order. I'll do my best, sir, but my best might not be enough. They climbed higher. By 1,800 hours, they'd reached an elevation of 8,000 feet. The air was thin breath coming in gasps. The temperature was 42 below zero, and then they heard it, a sound like thunder, like the world breaking apart. Nate looked up the mountain and saw a wall of white rushing toward them. Avalanche. Run, he screamed. Run. But there was nowhere to run. The trail was 20 feet wide, a cliff on one side, the mountain on the other. The avalanche hit like the fist of God. The world became white chaos, snow and ice and rock tumbling down the mountain at 80 miles an hour. Nate grabbed for something, anything, found Sullivan's hand held on with everything he had. The avalanche swept them off the trail. They fell. Nate remembered tumbling through white nothing, remembered the snap of someone's bone breaking, remembered Sullivan's hand being ripped from his grip. Then he hit something hard and everything went dark. When Nate woke up, he was buried under 3 feet of snow. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The weight was crushing, suffocating. Panic seized him. He thrashed, fought, clawed at the snow above him. His lungs burned. Spots danced in his vision. Then hands were digging, pulling him free. He burst into the air, gasping, choking on ice and blood. Aldrich leaned over him. "Easy, Lieutenant, easy. You're alive." Live. Nate looked around. They were at the bottom of a slope maybe 500 feet below where they'd been. The avalanche had carved a path of destruction down the mountain, and bodies were everywhere. Some men had been buried completely. Others had been smashed against rocks. Some had simply fallen off the cliff and disappeared into the darkness below. Nate counted the survivors. 43 men. They'd started with 183. In 48 hours, they'd lost 140 men. And the worst part, the part that made Nate want to scream, was that he didn't even know all their names. They'd died following him, and he didn't know who they were. Sullivan was among the survivors, one arm, clearly broken, of blood streaming from a gash in his forehead. But alive. Thornfield was not. They found the captain's body at the bottom of the debris field. His neck was broken. He'd died instantly. Aldrich closed Thornfield's eyes. He had 3 daughters, Maggie, Sarah, and Beth, 7, 5, and 3 years old. Nate felt something inside him shatter. 3 little girls who would grow up without their father. Because Nate had led him into the mountains on a map that might be a lie. Private Whitmore was dead too. They found his body with the letter from his mother still clutched in his frozen hand. Nate took the letter, added it to the map satchel. Someone would have to deliver it. Tell Mrs. Whitmore that her son had thought of her at the end. That someone would be Nate, if he survived. If any of them survived. Aldrich did a triage count. 43 men mobile, 19 with serious injuries. 8 of those unlikely to make it through the night. They had no choice. They left the 8, left them with morphine and what little medical supplies could be spared. Left them to freeze to death on the mountain. Nate wanted to stay with them. Wanted to hold their hands as they died. Take responsibility for what his decisions had cost. Aldrich pulled him away. "You can't help them, Lieutenant. But you can still help the living. Don't abandon them too." 43 men. That's all that remained. They started walking again as darkness fell. This time there was no question of stopping for the night. No question of rest. They walked through the darkness, through the killing cold, because stopping meant dying. Nate walked at the front, the map satchel heavy with letters from the dead. Behind him, 43 men followed, trusting him, believing he knew where he was going. He didn't. The avalanche had taken them miles off course. The map was useless now. He was navigating by dead reckoning and pure hope. But he kept walking, because the alternative was giving up. And giving up meant everyone died. At midnight, 12 hours into the longest day of Nate's life, they stumbled onto a frozen stream. Nate checked his compass, checked the stars, made his best guess about where they were. According to his calculations, they were 26 miles from where they'd started. 16 miles from the marine perimeter at Hagaruri, 16 miles. 43 men. And somewhere out there in the darkness, the Chinese were hunting them. But they'd made it this far, against impossible odds, through avalanches and cold that should have killed them all. They'd survived. Nate looked at the exhausted faces around him. Sullivan with his broken arm, Aldrich with frostbite blackening his fingers. Men who should have given up hours ago but hadn't. 16 miles, Nate said quietly. "We can do 16 miles. Sullivan managed a weak smile. "Hell, sir, 16 miles is nothing. We've come this far, haven't we?" They had, but the hardest part was still ahead. And Nathaniel Ashford, 22 years old, son of a disgraced senator following a map that might be a lie, was about to make decisions that would haunt him for the next 50 years. Decisions that would save 15,000 lives and cost more men everything. But those moments were still ahead. For now they rested by the frozen stream. 43 men who should have been dead. 43 men who refused to quit. And in the darkness above them, the Chinese were moving, closing in. The clock was ticking. The frozen stream became their lifeline. Nate had made the decision at 0200 hours after 3 hours of rest that felt like 3 minutes. The men were beyond exhausted. Several had stopped shivering, which Aldrich said was a bad sign. When your body quit trying to warm itself, you were close to the end. But they couldn't stay. The Chinese would find them by dawn. "We follow the stream," Nate said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "It flows east. That's the direction we need." "Sir," it was Aldrich, his face gray in the starlight. "I need to talk to you, privately." They walked 20 yards from the group, far enough that the others couldn't hear. "We've got 9 men who can't walk anymore," Aldrich said quietly. "Frostbite, hypothermia, exhaustion. Maybe more than that." Injuries from the avalanche that I can't treat out here. They're dying, Lieutenant. Slowly but dying. Nate had known this conversation was coming. Had been dreading it since they'd left the 8 men behind on the mountain. How long do they have? If we keep moving, maybe 12 hours, maybe less. Aldrich's breath formed ice crystals in the air between them. If we wait for them to recover, if we try to carry them, we all die. The Chinese will catch us, or the cold will. You're saying we have to leave them. I'm saying you have to make a choice. Aldrich's voice was gentle but firm. 9 men or 43. I can't make that call. But you can. Nate closed his eyes, saw Eleanor's face, saw his father, saw the Harvard diploma on the wall of his childhood bedroom. What did any of that matter here? What did 4 years of studying European history teach him about choosing who lived and who died? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. He opened his eyes. How many men would we need to leave with them to take care of them? 4, maybe 5. Someone who can keep a fire going, administer morphine, provide basic care. So we'd lose 13 or 14 men total. Yes. Nate looked back at the group. 43 men huddled in the darkness, waiting for him to decide their fate. No, not their fate. The fate of the 9 who couldn't walk anymore, and the fate of 15,000 Marines trapped at Hagaruri. If he kept everyone together, they'd move too slowly. The Chinese would catch them. Everyone would die or end up in a POW camp. If he left the 9 behind with caretakers, the remaining 30 men might make it, might reach the Marines, might show them the route out. The math was brutal, but it was the only math that made sense. Ask for volunteers, Nate said. 4 men to stay with the 9. Tell them we'll send help back as soon as we reach the Marine lines. Lieutenant, we both know. I know, but we tell them anyway. Give them hope. Aldrich nodded slowly. I'll stay. No, Nate grabbed his arm. I need you with the main group. You're the only doctor we have. These 9 men need medical care, and the 30 who keep walking will need it more. You can't help the 9, Aldrich. You just said so yourself, but you can keep the 30 alive long enough to reach safety. Nate's voice hardened. That's an order, Captain. Aldrich stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Yes, sir. They walked back to the group. Aldrich called for volunteers. 4 men stepped forward immediately. Private First Class James Holbrook, 23, from Vermont. A clerk who'd never fired his rifle in combat, but had stayed calm through every crisis. Corporal William Drexler, 26, from Iowa. A farm boy who knew how to survive harsh winters. Private Eugene Kraft, 21, from Montana. A hunter who could build a fire in any conditions. And Sergeant Raymond Nash, 32, from Tennessee. The oldest man in the battalion, a World War II veteran who'd fought at Bastogne. Nash looked at Nate with eyes that had seen too much. We'll take care of them, sir. You just make sure you reach those Marines. I will, Nate promised. Another lie, another hope that might mean nothing. The 9 injured men were gathered by a sheltered spot near the stream. Firewood was collected. Rations were distributed. Morphine was portioned out. And then came the hardest part, saying goodbye to men who knew they were being left to die. One of the 9 was a kid named Peters from Cleveland. Both legs had been crushed in the avalanche. Aldrich had splinted them, but Peters would never walk again without surgery. Peters grabbed Nate's hand as he passed. It's okay, sir. I understand. Just tell my mom I tried. Tell her I didn't quit. Nate knelt beside him. What's your mom's name? Catherine. Catherine Peters. Lives at 4427 Woodland Avenue, Cleveland, Ohio. Nate pulled out a small notebook, wrote it down with numb fingers. I'll tell her myself. When this is over, I'll go to Cleveland. I'll tell her what you did here. Thank you, sir. Peter's eyes were bright with unshed tears. And sir, you're doing the right thing, leaving us. We're done anyway. But you're not. Get those Marines out. Nate couldn't speak. Just squeezed Peters' hand and moved on. By 0300 hours, the separation was complete. 13 men by the stream, 30 men ready to march. Nate took one last look back as they left, saw the small fire, saw the silhouettes of the men who would freeze to death in the next 12 hours, saw Sergeant Nash raise one hand in a final salute. Nate returned it, then turned and walked away. Behind him, Sullivan spoke quietly. First time I left men behind was in France, near Bastogne. Christmas Eve, 1944. Still see their faces sometimes. Does it get easier? No, sir, it doesn't. But you learn to carry it, learn to remember them. Sullivan's broken arm was strapped tight to his chest. That's the price of command. You don't get to forget. They followed the frozen stream for 4 hours, 30 men moving like ghosts through the pre-dawn darkness. The temperature had dropped to 45 below zero, 2 men collapsed from hypothermia and couldn't be revived. 28 now. At 0700 hours, the sun rose, and with it came the Chinese. Nate saw them first. Movement on the ridge to the north, maybe 200 yards away. White winter camouflage, but he'd learned to spot the differences, the way they moved, the shape of their weapons. Contact north, he called. Chinese patrol ridge line. The men dropped into whatever cover they could find. Boulders, fallen trees, depressions in the snow. Nate counted, 15 Chinese soldiers. Against his 30? No, 28. 2 more men had collapsed in the last 10 minutes. The Chinese hadn't seen them yet. Were moving parallel to Nate's position, following the stream from above. If they kept quiet, let the patrol pass, they might avoid contact. But then one of the collapsed men, a private named Morrison, started convulsing. Hypothermia-induced seizure. He thrashed in the snow, making noise that carried in the frozen air. The Chinese patrol stopped. Heads turned toward the sound. Nate made the decision in half a second. Open fire, aim for the ridge. 28 rifles cracked simultaneously. The morning air filled with the sound of gunfire. On the ridge, Chinese soldiers fell. Others dove for cover, returning fire. Bullets zinged through the trees, thudded into snow. A man screamed. Another went down, clutching his leg. Sullivan, fighting one-handed, his rifle braced against a tree, fired methodically. Nate saw 2 Chinese soldiers drop from Sullivan's shots alone. The firefight lasted 90 seconds. When it ended, 12 Chinese lay dead on the ridge. 3 had escaped running north, but Nate's force had paid a price. 4 men dead, 3 wounded, 1 critically. 21 men left, and now the Chinese knew exactly where they were. We need to move, Nate said, his voice urgent. Now, those 3 will report our position. We'll have a company on us within the hour. Aldrich was working on the critically wounded man. Looked up, shook his head. He's not going to make it. How long? Oima? Minutes, maybe an hour if he's lucky. The man was Private Kenneth Rourke, 19 years old, from Philadelphia. A bullet had punched through his chest, probably punctured a lung. Blood bubbled from his lips with each breath. Rourke looked at Nate. Go, sir, leave me. I'm done. I can stay with him, one of the other wounded offered. Corporal Hayes shot through the shoulder, but still mobile. Keep him comfortable. Buy you time. No, Nate's voice was firm. We stay together. All of us. We carry him. Sir, that's suicide. The Chinese... I said we carry him. Nate's voice cracked. Too many left behind. Too many men dying because of his decisions. We don't leave anyone else. Not while they're still breathing. Sullivan and another man rigged a stretcher from rifle slings and a poncho. They lifted Rourke carefully. The kids screamed a sound that cut through Nate like a knife. They started moving again. Slower now, burdened by the stretcher. Behind them, Nate could hear bugles, Chinese signals, calling in reinforcements. They had maybe 30 minutes before the pursuit caught up. Private Rourke died 12 minutes later. They felt it through the stretcher. The sudden limpness, the cessation of his tortured breathing. Sullivan checked for a pulse, shook his head. They set the stretcher down. Nate knelt beside Rourke's body. The kid's eyes were still open, staring at nothing. I'm sorry, Nate whispered. I'm so sorry. Sir, Sullivan's voice was urgent. We need to go. Now. They left Rourke in the snow. No time for burial. No time for anything but survival. 20 men continued on. By 1100 hours, they'd covered another 4 miles. The stream had widened, becoming almost a small river. Ice cracked ominously under their weight as they crossed. The Chinese were behind them. Maybe a mile, maybe less. Nate could hear occasional gunfire. They were shooting at shadows, trying to flush the Americans out. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. Nate checked his map. According to his calculations, they were 10 miles from the marine perimeter. 10 miles. They could make it if the Chinese didn't catch them. If the cold didn't kill them. If. Always the ifs. At 1300 hours, they reached a fork in the stream. Nate's map showed the route continuing east following the main branch, but the smaller branch headed southeast toward rougher terrain. Which way? Sullivan asked. Nate studied the map. The eastern route was more direct, but it was also more open. If the Chinese were tracking them, that's the way they'd expect Americans to go. The southeast branch led into a narrow canyon, more dangerous terrain, easier to get trapped, but also easier to hide, easier to lose pursuit. Another decision. Another guess. Southeast, Nate said, into the canyon. Sir, that looks like a death trap. So does getting caught by 200 Chinese soldiers. We go southeast. They entered the canyon at 1330 hours. The walls rose steeply on both sides, maybe 300 feet of sheer rock and ice. The stream ran through the middle, a ribbon of frozen white. It was indeed a trap. If the Chinese caught them here, there would be no escape. But for now, they were hidden. The canyon walls blocked the wind. The temperature rose to a balmy -30. They made 8 more miles before nightfall, no sign of Chinese pursuit. Either they'd lost them or the enemy was taking a different route to cut them off. Nate didn't know which was worse. At 1900 hours with full darkness, he called a halt. The men were finished. Several were showing signs of advanced frostbite. One man had gone snowblind, 20 men left and most of them barely functional. Aldrich pulled Nate aside. Again, these conversations were becoming routine. We've got a problem. Just one? Nate's laugh was bitter. Food, we're out. Completely. We've been rationing, stretching what we had, but it's gone. The men haven't eaten in 18 hours. Nate felt the hunger in his own belly, had been ignoring it, pushing it down. But Aldrich was right. They were running on empty. How long can they keep going without food? In this cold burning, this many calories. Maybe another day. After that, they'll start shutting down. Hypothermia will set in faster. They'll lose the ability to think clearly. We're 2 miles from the marine perimeter. Can we make 2 miles in one day? Nate looked at the exhausted men, looked at the terrain ahead. The canyon would end in another mile opening onto a plateau. After that, it was open ground to Hagaru-ri. Open ground meant exposure, meant the Chinese could see them coming. It also meant speed, no obstacles, no climbing. If they pushed hard, if nothing went wrong, they could cover 2 miles in 6 hours. We move at first light, Nate said. Final push, everything we've got. And if the Chinese are waiting on that plateau, then we fight, because there's no other option left. The night was brutal. No fires too risky. The men huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat. Several had stopped shivering again. Nate sat with Sullivan, both of them leaning against a boulder. Tell me about your boys, Nate said. You have 2 right. Sullivan smiled, a real smile for the first time in days. Michael and Patrick, 8 and 6. Michael wants to be a fireman. Patrick wants to be a cowboy. Sullivan laughed quietly. Wife keeps telling him cowboys aren't real anymore. He doesn't believe her. What about you? What do you want to be? Sullivan was quiet for a moment. Right now, alive, I want to see my boys again. Watch them grow up. That's all I want. We're going to make it, Nate said. 2 miles. We can do 2 miles. Yeah, Sullivan didn't sound convinced. 2 miles. At 0400 hours before dawn, Nate woke to the sound of footsteps. Soft, careful, the crunch of boots on snow. He grabbed his rifle, peered into the darkness. Shapes moving. Lots of them. Ambush, he screamed. Chinese in the canyon. The world exploded. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning. Bullets ricocheted off canyon walls. Men shouted in English and Chinese, the sounds mixing, overlapping. Nate fired blindly, burning through his 8-round clip in seconds. Grabbed another from his belt, slammed it home, kept firing. Beside him, Sullivan fought one-handed, his broken arm useless. Aldrich was shooting with his pistol, methodical shots into the mass of attackers. The Chinese had found them, must have tracked them through the night, waited until just before dawn to attack. There were so many of them. 50, maybe more, against Nate's 20. This was it. This was where they died. Nate emptied another clip, reached for a third. His hand found nothing. He was out of ammunition. A Chinese soldier appeared in front of him, a rifle raised. Nate saw the muzzle, saw the finger tighten on the trigger. Then the soldier's head snapped back. He dropped. Sullivan stood behind him, smoke rising from his carbine. Borrowed this from a dead guy. You're welcome, sir. Thanks. Don't mention it. The firefight raged for 15 minutes. Nate lost track of time, lost track of everything except loading and firing, loading and firing. And then as suddenly as it started, it ended. The Chinese withdrew, melted back into the darkness, their bugles calling retreat. Nate stood in the sudden silence, breathing hard, his rifle hot in his hands. Around him, the canyon floor was covered in bodies. Chinese and American mixed together in death. He counted the survivors. 11 men. That's all that remained. 9 dead, including 2 who'd been wounded in the fight and bled out before Aldrich could reach them. 11 men out of 183. Sullivan was still standing, though he'd taken a bullet through the thigh. Aldrich was wrapping it, now his hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. Why'd they retreat? Sullivan asked through gritted teeth. They had us. We were out of ammo, out of options. Why pull back? Nate didn't have an answer. Not then. But an hour later, as dawn broke and they emerged from the canyon onto the plateau, he understood. The Chinese hadn't retreated. They'd repositioned. The plateau stretched before them 2 miles of open ground covered in snow, and on the far side, barely visible in the dawn light, was Hagaruri, the marine perimeter, safety. But between Nate's position and safety stood 200 Chinese soldiers, dug in, waiting. They'd been herded, driven into this position. The canyon had been a funnel and the plateau was the kill zone. Well, Sullivan said quietly, shit. Nate looked at his 11 men, looked at the 200 Chinese, looked at the marine perimeter 2 miles away. They'd come so far, lost so many, suffered so much. And now they were going to die within sight of rescue. Unless Nate pulled out his radio, had been saving the battery, using it only for emergencies. If this wasn't an emergency, nothing was. He keyed the handset. Any Marine station, this is Lieutenant Ashford, U.S. Army. Do you copy? I'm static. Any Marine station, this is Lieutenant Ashford. I have 11 men on the plateau 2 miles north of Hagaruri. We are surrounded by Chinese forces. Request immediate fire support. Over. More static. Then crackling through the distance. This is Hagaruri Fire Control. Say again, Army. You're 2 miles north. Affirmative, 2 miles north. We have intelligence maps showing inland evacuation route. Maps MacArthur needs. But we're pinned down by Chinese infantry. Request fire mission on following coordinates. Nate read off the coordinates of the Chinese positions, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the map. Stand by, Army. The wait felt like hours. Was probably 30 seconds. Army, this is Hagaruri Actual. We have 8-inch howitzers in range, but those coordinates are danger close to your position. Margin of error is 100 yards. If our calculations are off, we'll hit you instead. Do you copy? Nate looked at his 11 men, looked at Sullivan bleeding from his leg, looked at Aldrich, his fingers black with frostbite, looked at the 200 Chinese soldiers between them in safety. I copy, Hagaruri. Fire the mission. We'll take our chances. Understood, Army. Rounds out in 30 seconds. Get down and stay down. Nate didn't have to tell his men twice. They dropped flat in the snow, covered their heads. Nate counted. 29, 30. The world shook. The howitzer shells came in like the wrath of God. 8-inch rounds, each weighing 200 pounds, traveling at 1,500 feet per second. The Chinese positions erupted in geysers of snow and rock and fire. The explosions were so loud, Nate felt them in his chest and his bones. A shell landed 50 yards from his position. The concussion wave lifted him off the ground, slammed him back down. Another shell, another. The barrage lasted 2 minutes. Felt like 2 hours. When it ended, Nate's ears were ringing so badly he couldn't hear anything else. He raised his head, looked toward where the Chinese had been. Nothing. Just craters and smoke and scattered bodies. The radio crackled. Army, this is Hagaruri. Fire mission complete. How copy? Nate tried to speak and couldn't hear his own voice. Tried again. Good hits, Chinese positions destroyed. Outstanding, Army. We have a patrol heading your way. Stay put. They'll pick you up in 15 mics. 15 minutes. They'd made it. Nate looked at his 11 men, at Sullivan grinning despite the bullet in his leg, at Aldrich, tears freezing on his cheeks, at the others too exhausted to even celebrate. They'd made it. Sir, it was Sullivan. You did it. You got us here. Nate shook his head. We did it. All of us. No, sir. You led us, made the calls, carried us when we couldn't carry ourselves. Sullivan's voice was rough. A lot of men didn't make it, but 11 did. And because we made it, 15,000 Marines are going to get out. That's what counts. A lot of men. The number hit Nate like a physical blow. They died following his orders. Families would get telegrams. Parents, wives, children who would never see their loved ones again. Because of decisions he'd made. Because of a map that might still be wrong. The Marine Patrol arrived 12 minutes later. 6 men in winter gear, weapons ready. The sergeant in charge took one look at Nate's group and whistled low. Jesus Christ, you boys look like hell. Feel like it too, Sullivan said. Can we get out of this cold now? They were loaded onto jeeps, wrapped in blankets, given hot coffee that tasted like the best thing Nate had ever experienced. As they drove toward Hagaruri, Nate saw the Marine perimeter. 15,000 men dug in, surrounded but still fighting. Still alive. Because 11 men had made it through 42 miles of frozen hell to show them the way out. The jeep pulled up to a command tent. An officer emerged, full Colonel Marine Corps. You Ashford? Yes, sir. Got those maps MacArthur's been screaming about. Nate pulled the leather satchel from his shoulder, handed it over. The colonel opened it, pulled out the maps, studied them for a moment, then looked at Nate. Son, if these maps are good, you just saved this whole division. If they're not, he didn't finish the sentence. They're good, sir, Nate said. He had no idea if that was true. But he said it anyway, the colonel nodded. Get these men to the aid station. Full medical workup. Hot food, warm shelter. They've earned it. As they were led away, Nate heard the colonel talking to his staff. Route looks viable. Start planning. We move in 48 hours. 48 hours. In 48 hours, 15,000 Marines would follow the route Nate had scouted, would march the same 42 miles, would escape the Chinese encirclement, or would walk into an ambush if the maps were wrong. Nate closed his eyes. Tried not to think about it. Tried not to think about all the men who died to get him here. But he would think about them. Every day, for the rest of his life, their names burned in his mind. And somewhere in his pack, wrapped in plastic to keep them dry, were the letters. The letters from dead men to families who didn't know yet that their sons, husbands, fathers were never coming home. Nate would deliver those letters personally, every single one. It was the least he could do. The only thing he could do. The aid station at Hagaruri smelled like blood and gangrene and desperation. Nate sat on a cot while a Navy corpsman cut away his boots. His feet were white, the toes black at the tips. Frostbite, 2nd degree, maybe 3rd in places. You might lose some toes, the corpsman said, examining the damage. Could have been worse. Couple more hours we'd be amputating at the ankle. Worse. Everything could always be worse. Around him, the aid station was chaos. Wounded men on every available surface. Surgeons working under hanging lights, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. The sound of bone saws. The smell of ether. Men screaming. 11 men from Nate's group were scattered throughout the tent. Sullivan was in surgery, the bullet being removed from his thigh. Aldrich was having his frostbitten fingers examined. 3 others were being treated for hypothermia. They'd all survive, probably, with varying degrees of permanent damage. But they'd survive, unlike the others who wouldn't. A Marine lieutenant appeared beside Nate's cot, young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who'd seen too much combat in too little time. Lieutenant Ashford. Yes. Colonel wants to see you, soon as you're patched up. What about? The Marine lieutenant's expression was unreadable. The maps, sir, they have questions. Questions. Of course they did. Because nobody really knew if Li Chenwo had been legitimate or a Chinese plant. Nobody knew if the route would save 15,000 Marines or kill them all. And Nate was the only one who'd actually traveled it. 30 minutes later, his feet bandaged and numb with morphine, Nate limped into the command tent. A dozen officers stood around a table. Maps spread out, aerial photos, intelligence reports. The leather satchel Nate had carried for 42 miles sat in the center of it all. Colonel Edward Forney, commander of the Hagaruri garrison, looked up as Nate entered. Lieutenant, how are your men? Alive, sir, mostly. Mostly, Forney's voice was flat. I understand you lost 172 men getting here. Yes, sir, 172 dead or missing. And you brought 11 through. Yes, sir, Forney gestured to the maps. These routes, the intelligence that generated them. Walk us through it. Everything. Source reliability or assessment. Nate stepped to the table. His legs shook, whether from exhaustion or morphine or fear he didn't know. The primary source was Li Chenwo, South Korean civilian, age 47. Worked as a guide for the 8th Army from June to November 1950. He provided intelligence on Chinese troop movements, supply routes, terrain features. And his reliability. This from a Marine major face scarred from combat. Mixed, sir, about 70% of his information checked out. The rest was either outdated or inaccurate, but never deliberately false. At least not that we could prove. Until he disappeared. Yes, sir, 3 days before the Chinese offensive. Forney leaned forward. So he could have been a Chinese agent all along, could have fed you good intelligence to build trust, then gave you this route knowing it would lead us into an ambush. That's possible, sir. But you don't think so? Nate hesitated. This was the question that mattered. The one that would determine whether 15,000 Marines lived or died. No, sir, I don't think he was an agent. Why not? Because the route works, sir. We made it through. If Lee had wanted to kill us, he could have drawn the path through a dozen different kill zones. Could have marked false river crossings where the ice was thin. Could have led us into box canyons with no exit. Nate pointed to the map. This route, it's hard, brutal even, but it's navigable. Every landmark he marked was accurate. Every terrain feature matched. The only reason we lost so many men was the avalanche, and that was whether or not a trap. You're certain? No, sir, I'm not certain of anything, but I'm as sure as I can be given what I know. The officers exchanged glances, some silent communication Nate couldn't read. Finally, Forney spoke. The route you traveled, can 15,000 men make it through? Not the exact route, sir. The avalanche destroyed parts of it. But the general corridor, yes. If the weather holds, if they move fast, if... How many will we lose? The question hung in the air. Nate thought about the frozen stream, the canyon, the plateau, thought about men who'd frozen to death, fallen off cliffs, been killed in firefights. 10%, he said. Maybe 1,500 to 2,000 casualties. Jesus Christ, someone muttered. But the alternative is worse, Nate continued. The Chinese have you surrounded. They're bringing up artillery reinforcements. If you stay here, they'll grind you down, overrun the perimeter in a week, maybe less. Casualties will be 80–90%. The rest will be POWs. Forney studied the map. We have wounded, 2,000 men who can't walk. How do we evacuate them through mountain terrain? Nate hadn't thought about that. His group had left the wounded behind. Had to. But 15,000 Marines with doctors and medical supplies, an organization, they could do better. Couldn't they? Stretchers, sir, sleds. Rotate carriers every hour to spread the load. It'll slow you down, but it's possible. Slow us down how much? Double the time, maybe triple. We made 42 miles in 4 days. With wounded, call it 10 days, maybe 12. 12 days exposed in the mountains. With the Chinese hunting us, Forney shook his head. That's not a retreat. It's a death march. It's the only option, sir. The tent fell silent. Outside, Nate could hear artillery, Chinese guns probing the perimeter, testing the defenses. They were running out of time. A Marine general entered the tent, 2 stars on his collar. Everyone snapped to attention. At ease. The general's voice was gravelly worn. He looked at Nate. You're Ashford. Yes, sir. I'm General Oliver Smith, 1st Marine Division. Your maps just landed on my desk along with the personal message from Douglas MacArthur telling me to trust you. Smith's eyes were hard. You know what I think about Army lieutenants telling Marines what to do? No, sir. I think it's usually a recipe for disaster. Smith moved to the table, studied the maps. But MacArthur says you lost 172 men proving this route. Says you made decisions out there that no 22-year-old should have to make. That true? Nate's throat was tight. Yes, sir. Left wounded behind, left men to freeze, made the calls that kept the mission moving. Yes, sir. And you'd do it again. Same decisions, same route. Would he? If Nate could go back, knowing what he knew now, would he make the same choices? Leave Sergeant Nash and the 13 men by the stream, push through the avalanche, fight through the canyon, ambush. Yes, sir, I would. Smith nodded slowly. Then I'll trust you, Lieutenant. We move in 48 hours. You're going to brief my company commanders on every mile of that route, every danger, every decision point, everything you learned. Yes, sir. And Lieutenant, Smith's voice softened slightly. The men you lost, they died for something. You understand that their sacrifice gave 15,000 men a chance to live. That matters. But did the mathematics of survival make the deaths worthwhile? Nate didn't know. Wouldn't know for a long time. Maybe never. The next 48 hours were a blur. Nate briefed company commanders, described the terrain in exhaustive detail, marked the map with every hazard, every decision point, explained where they'd gone wrong, where they'd gotten lucky. The Marines listened, asked questions, took notes. They were professionals, combat veterans, men who'd fought across the Pacific, who'd landed at Incheon, who'd pushed all the way to the Chinese border. They didn't need a scared Army lieutenant to tell them how to fight, but they needed his map, and they listened. On the second day, a telegram arrived. Nate was in the aid station checking on Sullivan when a runner found him. Lieutenant Ashford, message for you. Personal. Nate took the yellow paper with shaking hands, opened it. Senator Harold Ashford, deceased, stopped suicide in federal custody. 22nd of May, 1951. Stop funeral private. Stop mother. Requests you do not attend. Stop. Nate read it 3 times. The words didn't change. His father was dead, had been dead for 7 months. And nobody had told him because he'd been in Korea unreachable, and by the time communications improved, someone had decided it wasn't important enough to relay. Or maybe they had tried. Maybe a telegram had gone to his unit, and the unit had been overrun, and the message had died with everyone else. It didn't matter. The result was the same. His father was dead, had killed himself rather than face the shame of a treason conviction. and Nate's mother didn't want him at the funeral. He sat on the edge of Sullivan's cot, the telegram clutched in his hand. "Bad news, sir." Sullivan's voice was groggy with morphine. "My father, he's dead." "I'm sorry." "Don't be. He was a traitor, apparently. Or McCarthy made him look like one. I don't even know which is true anymore." Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "Does it matter, truth versus appearance? Doesn't it? Not to the people he hurt. My dad used to say, doesn't matter if you meant to burn the house down or if you were just careless with matches. House is still burned." Nate looked at the telegram, at his father's name. Harold Ashford, senator, patriot, traitor, dead man. Which version was true? Had he passed secrets to the Soviets? Or had McCarthy destroyed him with lies Nate would never know now? The house was burned either way. "Sir," Sullivan shifted on his cot. "You okay?" "No, but I will be." Another lie. But maybe if he told enough of them, one would eventually become true. On the morning of December 6, 1950, 15,000 Marines began the march out of Hagaruri. Nate stood at the perimeter watching them organize, companies forming up. Wounded being loaded onto trucks, jeeps, anything with wheels. Gear being distributed. It was the largest fighting retreat in American history, and it was following a route that a dead South Korean guide had drawn, that a disgraced senator's son had scouted, that so many men had died to prove. General Smith approached. "You're not coming with us, Lieutenant." "Sir, you've done your part, more than your part. We're flying you and your men back to Japan. Medical treatment, rest, then home. I should go with you, in case there are questions about the route. The route is marked, my men know it. Your job is done." Smith's voice was firm. "Besides, you can barely walk. Your feet are destroyed. You try to march 42 miles on those, you'll lose them both." Nate knew Smith was right, but it felt wrong. Felt like abandoning the Marines to a fate he'd chosen for them. "Sir, if the route is wrong, if Lee was an agent, if this is a trap, then we'll fight our way out. That's what Marines do." Smith extended his hand. "You did good, son. Saved a lot of lives. Don't diminish that by second-guessing yourself." Nate shook his hand. "Good luck, sir." "Luck's got nothing to do with it. We're Marines. We don't need luck." The column began moving at 0800 hours. 15,000 men walking into the frozen mountains, following Nate's route. Nate watched them go, watched until the last man disappeared into the distance. Then he turned and limped toward the airfield where a C-47 waited to take him away from this frozen hell. Sullivan was already on board along with the other 9 survivors from Nate's group. Aldrich sat in the back, his ruined fingers bandaged. The plane lifted off at 0900 hours. Through the window, Nate could see the Marine column, a dark line against the white snow, heading north then east following the route he'd marked, towards salvation or destruction. He wouldn't know which for 10 more days. Japan was warm. That was the first thing Nate noticed. Warm and clean and safe. The field hospital at Yokosuka Naval Base had hot showers, real beds, food that didn't come from a can. It felt obscene, like he didn't deserve it. The doctors examined his feet. 2nd and 3rd degree frostbite. 3 toes would probably have to come off, maybe 4. "You're fortunate," the doctor said. "Could have been much worse." Fortunate. Everyone kept saying that. Nate didn't feel fortunate. He felt hollow. The days blurred together, surgery on his feet, recovery, physical therapy, letters from Eleanor that he didn't answer. And every evening he listened to the radio, waiting for news from Chosin. On December 11th, the news came. 1st Marine Division has successfully broken through Chinese encirclement. 15,000 men reached safety at Hungnam. Casualties estimated at 1,200, killed 5,000, wounded. Largest fighting retreat in Marine Corps history. 1,200 dead, 5,000 wounded, but 13,000 alive. The road had worked. Lee's maps had been real. Nate's decisions, as brutal as they were, had been right. A lot of men to save 13,000. Mathematics General Smith could live with. Could Nate Sullivan found him that evening, sitting alone in the hospital courtyard. "You hear the news, sir?" "Yeah. They made it. The Marines made it." "I know." Sullivan sat beside him on the bench. His leg was in a cast crutches, leaning against the wall. "So why do you look like you lost?" "Because I did lose. So many men, Sullivan. And you saved 13,000. Sir, with all respect, you need to make peace with what you did out there, because what you did was right." "Was it I left 13 men to freeze by that stream? Left 8 on the mountain. I got Private Rourke killed by insisting we carry him. I led us into that canyon where 9 more died. Every decision I made got someone killed. Every decision you made saved someone else. Sullivan's voice was firm. Sir, I've been in combat since 1944. I've seen officers freeze, make no decisions, and get everyone killed. I've seen officers make bad decisions and get everyone killed. You made hard decisions, impossible decisions, and you got 11 of us out alive. 11 out of 183. 11 who wouldn't have survived without you. 11 who have families that will see them again. My boys, they're going to have a father because you made the calls that kept us moving. Sullivan stood, grabbed his crutches. You want to feel guilty, fine, carry that weight. But don't you dare diminish what you did. Don't dishonor those who didn't make it by acting like their sacrifice meant nothing. He limped away, leaving Nate alone with his thoughts. The letters arrived 2 days later. Personal effects from the men who'd died. The Army had shipped them to the hospital marked for Lieutenant Ashford. Manila envelopes, dog tags, lives reduced to paper and metal. Nate opened them one by one. Private Whitmore's letter to his mother in Ohio. Sergeant Raymond Nash's wedding ring. Corporal Hayes's photograph of his daughter. Private Kenneth Rourke's Bible bloodstained. And then an envelope that made Nate's breath catch. Private First Class Thomas Brennan, 21 years old, from Boston. Mrs. Catherine Brennan, 447 Beacon Street, Boston, Massachusetts, less than 2 miles from where Nate had grown up. From where Eleanor lived, he could deliver this letter in person. Could tell Mrs. Brennan that her son had died following a questionable map through frozen mountains because a disgraced senator's son had convinced everyone it was the right thing to do. He opened the letter, read the words Thomas Brennan had written to his mother. Dear Mom, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I'm sorry. I know you didn't want me to join up, but I had to. Same reason Dad fought in the last war. Because some things are worth dying for. I hope I made you proud. Tell Mary I love her. Tell her to marry someone good. Someone who'll treat her right. I love you, Mom. Don't cry too much. I went doing something that mattered. Your son, Tommy. Nate folded the letter carefully, put it back in the envelope, then opened the next one. And the next, letters, final messages. Families who deserved to know their sons, husbands, fathers hadn't died for nothing. And Nate would tell them, personally, every single one. It was the least he could do, the only thing he could do. Eleanor came to the hospital on December 18th. Nate was in physical therapy, learning to walk again on his ruined feet when a nurse told him he had a visitor. He hobbled to the waiting room, and there she was, more beautiful than he remembered. Wearing a blue dress, her hair pinned up, a small suitcase at her feet. Eleanor. Nate. Her eyes were red. She'd been crying. I came as soon as I heard you were here. Took 3 days to get back to flights, but I came. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She crossed the room, took his hands. I got your letters, from Korea. All 15 of them. I'm sorry I didn't write more. I'm sorry I didn't understand. When you left, I thought you were running away. I was angry. I said terrible things. You had every right. No, I didn't. Eleanor's grip tightened. Your father died, Nate, and I didn't even know how to reach you to tell you. By the time I found out you were in Korea, he'd been gone for months. I'm so sorry. Nate felt the familiar numbness, the same emptiness he'd felt reading the telegram. It's okay. We weren't close. That doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Maybe, maybe not. Nate honestly didn't know what he felt anymore. Eleanor pulled an envelope from her purse. Your mother asked me to give you this. She's not well, Nate. The scandal, your father's death, it broke something in her. She doesn't want to see anyone. Nate took the envelope, didn't open it. There's something else, Eleanor said quietly. I'm pregnant. The world stopped. What? 4 months from before you left. I didn't know until after you'd shipped out. I tried to tell you in letters, but I don't think they ever got through. Nate did the math. September to December. 4 months. He was going to be a father. Does your family know? Yes, they're not happy. Wanted me to give the baby up. I refused. Eleanor met his eyes. I know we're not married. I know your family is disgraced. Mine is humiliated. I know this is a disaster by every social measure that matters. But I don't care anymore. I want this baby. Our baby. Eleanor minced him. You don't have to marry me. I'm not here to trap you. I just thought you should know. Thought you deserved to know you're going to be a father. Nate looked at her, at this woman who traveled halfway across the world to tell him news that would ruin her socially, who'd defied her family to keep their child. I want to marry you, he said, if you'll have me. Nate, you don't have to. I want to, not because of the baby, not because of duty, because I love you. I've always loved you. I just needed to figure out who I was first. And have you figured out who you are? Nate thought about the frozen mountains, about all the men who'd followed his orders, about 13,000 Marines who'd followed his map to safety. I'm a man who makes hard decisions, he said quietly, and lives with the consequences. That's who I am now. Eleanor kissed him, gently, carefully, like he might break. Maybe he would. Maybe he was already broken, held together only by duty and stubbornness. But he could still do this. Could still be a husband, a father. Could still build something good from the wreckage. They were married 3 days later, a quiet ceremony in the hospital chapel. Sullivan stood as best man, still on crutches. Aldrich gave the bride away, his bandaged hands resting on Eleanor's arm. 11 survivors attended, the men who'd made it through 42 miles of frozen hell. They were a family now, bound not by blood, but by what they'd survived together. On April 15, 1951, Eleanor gave birth to a son, Nathaniel Ashford Jr. Nate held his son for the first time in a hospital in Boston and felt something shift inside him. Some peace that had been frozen since Chosen began to thaw. He's perfect, Eleanor whispered. Yeah, he is. What are we going to tell him when he's old enough to ask about Korea, about what you did there? Nate looked at his son's tiny face, at this new life, innocent and perfect and full of possibility. The truth, he said. When he's ready, I'll tell him the truth. About the decisions I made, about the men who died, about the price of leadership. Will you tell him it was worth it? Was it so many men for 13,000? A father's suicide for a son's survival. A family's disgrace for a nation's gratitude. Mathematics General Smith could live with. Mathematics Nate was learning to carry. I'll tell him that sometimes there are no good choices, Nate said softly. Only less terrible ones. And you make the best decision you can, and you live with it, and you honor the people who paid the price. He looked at Eleanor, at his son, at the future stretching before them. A future built on the graves of men whose names Nate would never forget. I'll tell him that's what it means to lead, Nate continued, to carry the weight of those who followed you, to remember their names, to make sure they didn't die for nothing. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder. They didn't. You made sure of that. Maybe. Nate hoped so. But hope and certainty were different things. And certainty was a luxury he'd lost somewhere in the frozen mountains of North Korea. All he had now was duty, responsibility. The obligation to make those deaths mean something. Starting with the letters he still needed to deliver. Families who deserved to hear the truth from the man who'd led their sons into the cold. It would take him 2 years to visit them all. Boston, Massachusetts, October 1951. 6 months after Nathaniel Jr. was born, Nate stood on the front steps of 447 Beacon Street. The brownstone was elegant, well-maintained, the kind of house that spoke of old Boston money. In his hand he held a letter, blood-stained at the edges, written by a boy who'd never come home. Nate had delivered 17 letters so far. Cleveland, Philadelphia, Vermont, Montana. Each visit the same, each family different. Some cried, some stayed silent. All of them thanked him. He didn't want their thanks, he wanted their sons back. But that wasn't possible. So he gave them what he could. The truth, the last words, the assurance that their boys had mattered. He raised his hand, then knocked. Footsteps inside, the door opened. A woman stood there, early 50s, gray hair, eyes that had cried too many tears. Mrs. Brennan. Yes. My name is Nathaniel Ashford. I served with your son Thomas. I have a letter from him. May I come in? She stared at him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Please. Nate walked into the house. The door closed behind him. Outside, autumn leaves fell on Beacon Street. The city moved on as cities do. But inside that house, time stopped. A mother would read her son's last words. A lieutenant would explain how Tommy Brennan died. And when Nate left an hour later, he would walk to the next address on his list. And the next, 17 down, 17 to go. The work of carrying the weight had only just begun.